Hello everyone, welcome back, part 2, following the threads of Federici. It is a Tuesday today. Normally I make my videos on a Wednesday, but after the last episode I did too much research. Or like, you can never do too much research, but you know when you like read so much and you don't know how to start. So rather than trying to harness the power of Mercury, it's Tuesday, going to harness the power of Mars and get it out there. So let's get started. Now, last week we were looking at heretical sects or heretical groups of the Middle Ages, and looking at, as Federici says, a lot of these groups had strong independent women as the leaders. They were economically independent, also challenged both the authority of the Catholic Church as well as kind of this emerging idea of the nuclear family in which women should be the domesticated housewife. So we looked at the Beguines, who were economically independent, some say lazy vagabonds who wanted a direct erotic connection with God. We also looked at the movement of the free spirit, who were kind of maybe like more middle class but wandering mystical anarchists who may or may not have had a naked mass. And also I'd like to add, like, I don't feel in the last episode I stressed enough like the role of the secular courts in this kind of demonization and persecution of like dissident groups, which is the whole center of Federici's thesis, but I hope today is going to become more clear. So we ended with the movement of the free spirit, and we're going to start today by looking at one particular heretical group who, in and of themselves, they're not as exciting as the Beguines or the Flagellants, but they are central to our story. So the Valdenses, I think that's how you say it, who they're kind of like a form of sober Protestantism. Now they were beginning in the 1100s, so they were like forerunners of the Reformation, but it's this group who slowly started to be given these supernatural powers. They were accused of like riding on brooms and going to the Sabbat. So we're going to investigate this kind of transformation of heretics into witches, and we're going to do so by delving in deep into the region of the Western Alps. This is where the first witch hunts started. So the original trial of the first witch hunts have been lost. But so one of the first official recordings was 1420 in this region, but as we'll see, there are other reports of kind of trying witches in like 1398, which is 14th century. I've learnt my centuries this time. Now I did want to print off a map, but I've run out of ink, so it looks shoddy, but I've drawn one myself. So this is where we're going to go. First, oh god, Europe, for those that don't know, Alp region. And we're going to look in here, the Western Alps. So this is like borderland territory where there are great grabs of power. Also the economic situation was changing, and it was a hotbed of heretical activity. So there's a few processes we're going to discuss. One, how heretical groups who were Christians got transformed into like witches. So it's here that this idea of the diabolical gazelle shaft, the witch conspiracy, emerged. Before that, kind of witchcraft and sorcery was kind of seen either as like an individual affair, or to return back to this canon episcopi from 906, which said like people who believe these things, it's victims of demonic delusion. But no, witchcraft got transformed into a real concrete threat, and it was believed that there was this secret society where individuals had pledged themselves to the devil to bring down Christendom. So this idea emerged, and also across this century was when the figure of the witch became firmly fixed as a female. So as we'll see, so we're looking specifically at the 1400s, which is the 15th century, and it was through this century that the witch got transformed into a female, from heretic into witch. And so we'll end with the Malleus Maleficarum. Now most people seem to think this is where like the witch hunt started, but no, the Malleus did not emerge from a political vacuum. So this is what we're going to look at today. Get ready. Okay, so let's dive in with the Valdens, or the Valdensians as I think it's said. So they started in 1160 in Lyon by a guy called Peter Valdo. He was a wealthy merchant who gave up all his wealth, or actually I think he just gave it to his wife, but let's not get into the details here. So he renounced his wealth and started this heretical movement who, at first they were called the Poor of Lyon, later they became the Waldenses after Peter Valdo. So what were their doctrines? Well, for starters, renouncing wealth. They challenged the Catholic Church and ecclesiastic authority in a number of ways. First, as I said, kind of like sober Protestantism, or well, as it was in this era. So they challenged like transubstantiation, that, you know, wine and water is the blood of Christ. They said that holy water is no different from rainwater. And they also said that, you know, you can worship the Lord just as well in a barn as you can in a church. So for many reasons, as you can see, like this group attracted a lot of lay people. Also, translated the Bible into the vulgar tongue or whatever. So it was translated from Latin into ways that actually people could read. What else did they do? Oh yeah, so they said that, you know, the supreme authority is in the body. And so I saw one of their logos online which had some Latin beneath it, but I don't want to say their slogan, because this was the time before like marketing probably, but they had a phrase that says the light shines within, which again reminds me of these other groups who, rather than looking to this centralised authority of the Catholic Church to give them a connection with God, it puts the power in with the people and you can get around this centralised power. So that was the basic outline of what the Valdenses were about. As I said, they don't sound very witchy, although we're going to get into this in another episode, but they directly undermined the Catholic Church, and in 1215 they were declared heretical, but nonetheless they had a large following. And so the Valdenses terribly, terribly persecuted, and I think actually some still exist today in the US, but so as we're going to look, the Valdenses and the persecution of these is what transformed into the witch hunt. There's not just the Valdenses, so as many scholars say, we shouldn't look for like a monocausal explanation of the witch hunts. And as Carlo Ginzburg kind of tries to explain, also like Jewish people were some of the early individuals who were targeted by the Inquisition. But where are we going? Yeah, so if you imagine, they were in Lyon. Let's get out my shoddy map again. Oh, so here we are, Lyon. And if you imagine groups heavily persecuted, they retreated into the Alps, probably hoping that they could practice in peace. But no, it didn't happen. So as I said, the Western Alps, hotbed of heretical activity. And it was in this area that there was the concept of the standing Inquisition, which, you know, it was just ongoing trials. So this was kind of the juridical framework which facilitated the emergence of the witch hunts. What else? Also in this region, as we're going to show some more examples, but so the secular courts started to try both heretics and witches. So here we are in the Western Alps, hotbed of heretical activity, already the legal framework in which to like persecute through a judicial process dissident individuals. Now also, this was an area, so my map, I mean, as I said, it's shoddy, maybe I shouldn't refer to it, or maybe I should get an official map. But anyway, so this was a place where lots of like political grabs, so we've got, I don't think it exists now, the Duchy of Savoy, and Valais. Oh, I didn't put Valais on here, but anyway, there are all these different areas with different dukes and political families trying to grab power. And as we'll see in our concrete examples, it was also a changing economic landscape. Now, as Federici points out, this was in the transition between feudalism to capitalism, so from kind of self-subsistence farming to agriculture for the market. So in a lot of these places, they went from like subsistence farming to creating like hay and grain for the market. And as a result of this shift, there was food shortages, famine, also like economic, well that is economic, but political and social turmoil. So all of these factors coming together, stirring the cauldron in which this diabolical Gesellschaft emerged, which is what we're going to talk about now. Also, side note, just want to say, if anyone's thinking from my outfit, wearing red, white and blue, maybe suspecting that I'm a little Brexiteer, don't worry, I've got my blooming EU leggings on. Now, there's enough to say about supranational organisations, but I feel like Brexiteers need to get off the island and realise Britain is not the centre of the world. But actually they shouldn't, because probably covered in corona. Little side note, so blooming Britain covered in corona, my hometown, Oldham, yes, Oldham, second worst hit with corona, like the R rate there, 700 plus for every 100,000 people, versus like London is like 200 and something, which makes me really sad, makes me really like, I don't know, like the other day someone tried to wind me up by talking about Margaret Thatcher, and usually my response to Margaret Thatcher is nothing but contempt and anger, but actually I cried, fucking cried. And like what we're seeing now in the northwest and the north of England is her legacy continued. Destruction of social structures, of healthcare and these networks of care. But actually, blooming Andy Burnham, I know he's like within the political system, but he is fighting the good fight. Anyway, that was a little diversion I had to get off my chest. So let's get to the matter at hand, which is funny folk living in the hills being either persecuted or manipulated by groups for their own political gain. Let's get to the Western Alps and the witch conspiracy. Okay, so the Western Alpine region, hotbed of heretical activity, places where there were political and economic land grabs, different dukes, families and states trying to assert their power, also the place of the Standing Inquisition. And so it was here that this conspiracy, rumours of a diabolical sect operating in the hills, doing all kind of nefarious activities, harmful sorcery, pledging themselves to the devil. This is where it emerged. And as I said before this, so sorcery, witchcraft, night flight, it was on the church's radar, but it was perceived to be, or people who believed in this sort of thing, of women or individuals who would ride off with Diana on these nocturnal journeys. They were seen as being victims of demonic delusion, and actually those who believed such things to be true, to have a material reality, themselves were called infidels or heretics. Whereas in this 15th century, this is where the attitudes change. This is where, in fact, to deny the existence of the witches' sect, in fact, was heretical. So what happened here? So there's two, I'm not sure if they're papal bulls. Well, one is a letter from Pope Eugenius, I think, and the second one is a bull from Pope Alexander. Now, this first letter, addressed to this inquisitor, whose name is quite humorous, probably pronouncing it wrong, Ponce Foigeron. So Ponce Foigeron was one of the early people recording that they were they tried in court groups who had said that they had pledged themselves to Satan and they were going to bring down society. And so in response to these reports from the inquisitors, who in fact were just asking for more money to conduct their inquisitorial activities, so there was this idea, like, spread partly by these papal bulls, and we're going to see how these developed, that there was these groups. At first they presented as Jews and Christians who would renounce their faith and trying to convert others to this strange society where they are casters of spells, and so this, sorry, gonna get comfortable. So before we get to the Malleus, we're going to look at two demonological doctrines. Now, again, to reiterate, as Federici says, the witch hunts were not just the product of Catholic superstition and the last dying sparks of a feudal era, but were heavily conducted by secular courts, whereas the Catholic Church provided the ideological scaffold. So they were, making the propaganda in these demonological texts, which were then sent out to various clergy members. But where is the state in all this? Now, as we're going to see, not in the first text we talk about, but the second, a lot of the sources came from secular judges who were holding these courts. So this is where the heretics, the Valdensians, who were, practicing in the hills. There was also like a lot of heretical syncretism. So to return to the shoddy map, where are you? Where are you, shoddy map? Here. So if you imagine, so there are a lot of heretic groups, and last time I said I was going to talk about the Cathars. Can't be bothered getting into the Cathars because it's a whole other thing. But if you imagine all these, there are also like other heretical groups just, wandering through the mountains from Italy, from France. And if you imagine, you're in one of these like small villages in the Alps, and some charismatic leader comes and puts in some kind of interesting ideas, they will fuse in with like local folklore, local ideas, and with like the economic and social situation, and will, kind of morph a little bit. So as we look at all these heretical groups and also the individuals who tried them in the courts, it's not a concrete, homogeneous process. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. Okay, let's just get down to the Demological Doctrines in which the Waldenses became witches. So, first text to look at is called, I think I'm saying it right, Aurora's Gazorium, published in 1435. Now, kind of a translation of this, I've seen a few different ways it's been translated, but for ease of our thing, the error of the Valdenses. Now, Gazari is kind of a term for a cat, although these heretical groups were accused of like worshipping the devil in the form of a cat. They would go to their like nocturnal gatherings and give this cat a little kiss on the bottom and renounce their Christian faith. So it was in the Auroras Gazorum, Error of the Valdenses, or Error of Heretics, Gazari. Unknown author, but probably it's attributed to the, I don't know how to say it, Duchy of Savoy, the Duke of Savoy. Amadeus, I think his name was, but don't quote me on that. This was an area where there's a lot of inquisitorial activity. So this is where the outline of the witches' sabbat was first like put in stone or in written form. So it accused the heretics of flying to the sabbat on their brooms, of engaging in orgies, infanticide, pledging themselves to the devil. So it was in this text which concretized this shift from witchcraft being seen as either individual or the product of delusions to an actual concrete thing, and it sowed the seeds of this witch conspiracy. So there we have Aurora's Gazorium, and so this firmly put the Valdenses as witches. And so also this area was lots of like different linguistic zones, so you know, some people speaking in French, theoretically this is what is now known as Switzerland, but I don't think it existed back then as it is now called. But so in some areas, I think Savoy, Dauphine, the Valdenses were called, or following the Valdens, it's called Vaudery. But then this also started to become used as a term for witchcraft. So there would be things like they would refer to, like in the trials, like, did you go to the Waldensian Sabbat? Or actually, it was quite often called a synagogue, which again gives like more evidence to the Ginsburg thesis that it was Jewish people who were also early targets of the Inquisition. But like, did you go to the Waldensian synagogue and burn the babies and eat them? Also, in this area, there was also lots of like visual depictions of the Valdenses on brooms. So here we have it. We have the heretical group being attributed with supernatural and diabolical powers. But so this is the unknown article 1435. Next, we're going to talk about a guy called Johannes Nider, German Dominican monk or theologian, whose book Formicarus was central to establishing this idea of the diabolical Gesellschaft. Now it's this text that Heinrich Kramer, our old friend or nemesis, who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, actually I think he was a real fanboy of Nider, and a lot of his text is directly taken from this. Johannes Nider, spent a lot of time reading about this guy. Whenever I'm reading about this stuff, I get a bit weird. I've been up all night reading like these horrible inquisitorial texts. It's not good. I think this grey day matches the sombre nature of this talk. So I'm going to have a cup of tea, prepare myself, and then we're going to dive into these gross demonological doctrines. So, Johannes Nider, German Dominican, who studied in Vienna. He was like a staunch reformer of the church, and he also opened the Council of Basel in 1431, which was a great meeting place of minds. I think it was a religious council, but it was here where lots of theologians, inquisitors, who had also had contact with secular authorities, were discussing these strange groups they've met in the hills and coming up with their own theories about them. So if we're looking for the conspiracy of the time, to be honest, I think that was it, but let's not get into that right now. So Johannes Nider opened the council in 1931, and God, I need to stop sitting on a cushion. I only deserve the floor. Right, so Johannes Nider opened the council in 1431. He wrote his book, Formicarus, I'm not sure. He wrote it between 1435 and 1437. And so the name comes from the Latin for an ant colony and refers to a certain proverb, which is, "Go to the ant, O lazy one, and consider its ways and learn its wisdom." So it kind of reflects this idea of like the model of society is this disciplined ant colony of workers, which actually, now I think about it, could fit in well with this emerging idea of the capitalist ethics. So this book, it was set up as a dialogue, which I said before, like a lot of these texts were. So a dialogue between Theologus and Piga, his name was, the lazy one. So it's like from teacher to student, which is a good way to like raise questions and contradictions and uncertainties and explain them through the dialogue. There were 5 books in total, and the last book was dedicated to witches and their deceptions. And so it was in this text where the fully formed idea of the witch stereotype emerged, and also the idea of the diabolical gazelle shaft. So what is this witch stereotype? So the witch is a figure who conducts maleficium, I'm not sure, harmful sorcery. So what kind of harmful sorcery are we talking about? We've got classic infanticide, hail raising, causing storms, withering crops, impend fot, so affecting people's fertility, making people lose their babies or they can't have children, causing disease, having orgies. Now a lot of these kind of crimes, accusations have historically often been attributed to these kind of outside heretical groups, but the witches differed because they could achieve none of this harmful sorcery by their own powers alone. And it was actually through making a pact with the devil that they gained these powers. So to do so, they had to renounce their Christian faith and make a pact, which usually happened at a nocturnal gathering. And we're going to see a common theme is drinking the witch's brew. And as soon as you drink this, one effect is you get all these powers, you get all this knowledge, and by doing so you are initiated as a member into this sect. So that is the witch stereotype. And as we'll see, the different reports. So Nider, as we said, he was a member of the council in Basel, and he was talking to lots of types of people. And the 2 main sources, one is another inquisitor from somewhere in France, I think, or Lucerne, which I'm not sure. I'll double check that. But so the guy who we're going to talk, who is the most interesting character, is a guy, Peter von Greyer, a secular magistrate from Bern, so which is now Switzerland. And so a lot of reports came from Peter von Greyer, which if you're in the occult world is quite an interesting name. But anyway, so Peter von Greyer, he was a magistrate for the Bernese council, And as I've said a few times, this area was like, there were lots of political land grabs, power grabs at the time. And so Peter of Bern, he was sent to a place called the Simmental Valley in the Alps. And he was sent there with the task of trying to impose or introduce Bernese legal jurisdiction, kind of like overseeing the transition of power. And this was in a peacetime, so, you know, rather than conducting war, how do you establish power? How do you discipline the folks and show them who's in charge? Well, you do it through trials. You do it through, you know, the secular courts weren't necessarily doing the Inquisition, but if you imagine sowing the seeds of doubt, of fear in these communities and showing them who's boss, that was the job of Peter von Greyer. So, the Simmental Valley, or the Simmer Valley, looking at the material conditions. Now, we just said about the kind of political side of things. In terms of the economic side, again, changing economic landscape as the kind of farming, agricultural practices shifted from subsistence farming to growing hay for the kind of, I don't want to say global because this wasn't the time, but you know, the wider market. So in that sense, people kind of lost their means to subsistence. There was a lot of like economic competition being introduced, and it was in this area. So there's one classic example of harmful sorcery that comes from Peter von Greyer, and it is from a report. So as we said, Nider was writing in 1435, but Peter of Bern, the secular magistrate, his stories come from like 1398, so it's about 40 years before. But so it's kind of these kind of reports of like the whispers of Peter von Greyer, which started to sow the seeds of the diabolical conspiracy, and then Nider puts them in his text and like ferments this idea. So we have a fellow called Stadlin who lived in Boltingen. So this was a man who was accused of sorcery. And so what was he accused of? Manipulating the weather and stealing crops. Again, could be linked to this economic situation. He's also accused of like terrorizing his neighbours, causing them to be infertile. And now, while under torture, he confessed that he made his neighbour infertile by burying a lizard under her doorstep, which I think they went back and managed to find the bones of a lizard beneath someone's doorstep. So that's what Stadlin did. And so, well, what's this got to do with a diabolical conspiracy? Well, under more torture, he revealed that he learnt his witchy wisdom from like a lineage of teachers. So there was a guy called Hoppo who he learnt from, who learnt from a guy called Scavius, which literally translates as scabby man, who was operating in 1375. Now this name Scabby Man makes some people think perhaps he was a leper who, to return back to Carlo Ginzburg, his ideas of the original targets of the witch hunt and the Inquisition were Jews and lepers, so Scavius, the Scabby Man, is important there. So Scavius, he was said to be able to turn himself into a mouse and evade. I really need to stop doing this because that's when my iPad always crashes. Below my neck. So where were we? Scabby Man Scavius turn himself into a mouse, which is some of these first reports of animal metamorphosis, which became central to the witch stereotype. So that was one of the classic, much quoted examples of harmful sorcery, witchcraft in the Western Alps, reported from Peter von Greyer, given to Nider. Next, example, Peter von Greyer, as we said, magistrate, trying to introduce the authority of Bern in these little backwater hills in the Alps. How are you going to do that? He went on the hunt of people who committed infanticide, which again, classic charge of witches killing children. So he tried 13 individuals who, both male and female, who supposedly killed children, mostly unbaptized children, killed them with their sorcery. They were then buried and they would bring them from their graves. They would cook up these children, and from the children they would make 2 types of potions, or as it's called, an unguent. I think that's how you say. But let's just call it the witch's brew because my pronunciation is not the best. So they would make from boiling down the fat of these dead little babies. Shouldn't seem so excited about this. From the graphic, horrible things they were accused of is murdering children, cooking the bones, cooking them until the flesh fell off the bones. And from the fat that remained, they would make this kind of witch's salve, which then they would take this salve to their nocturnal gathering, and this is when the members of the sect would renounce their Christian faith, maybe trample on the cross if they're feeling saucy, and then they would drink the brew, and then they would be initiated into the sect. So this was the rapport. Now, to bring it back to the Federici thesis, infanticide is quite an interesting crime because, as Federici says, partly the reason that women were then domesticated, they lost control of their bodies and were set with the noble, great task of reproducing the workforce. Whereas, so this was directly in response to the Black Death, which was in the 1300s, 1338 I want to say. And after that, there was a great population shortage. And after that, this is when the state needed to get involved and ensure that there was a reproduction of the labour force. Now, if you imagine the act of infanticide, okay, killing children is a bad thing. I don't even know why I'm saying this. But if we think of like what's going on in the shadows, you know, women losing control of their bodies. For example, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about like herbalism and the professionalization of medicine. But for example, ideas of abortion, perhaps, controlling your fertility with herbs. These are all kind of slowly becoming diabolicized. So this is why, I mean, there's many reasons why, but this is kind of, maybe let's see, is like the seeds of biopolitics being put into action in these villages, while also giving this diabolical nature. Now, blowing Peter von Greyer, as I said, secular magistrate, by the end of his life, he thought he was getting haunted by witches, and supposedly they threw him down the stairs, which, fair play, I think. But anyway, to return back to Nider, as we'll see, most of the examples in here are men. But you might wonder, but I thought witches were women. I thought Federici said this was a war on women. Well, it is. And we're going to get there soon with the Malleus Maleficarum. But just right now, while we want to like show, what are we showing? How hereticism got conflated with sorcery. These idea of nocturnal gatherings, of being initiated into a group which was very much separate from the Catholic Church. These kind of actions became demonized. And before we move on, I would very much like to share with you probably what is one of my favourite reports of the Diabolical Gesellschaft, which comes from Lucerne. The report came in 1438, but it actually happened 10 years earlier. In a valley, it's called like Henevs or something like that. But anyway, 100 heretics were burnt at the stake. And this is another idea of where these nocturnal gatherings and an underground society were taking place. Now, these heretic witches, what they admitted to is they would fly to their nocturnal gatherings on sticks, and on the way to there, they would stop in the cellars, drink the best wine, and then shit in the barrels, which for me sounds like a great activity that perhaps starving, exhausted peasants might like to do in an area of great wealth and, you know, all these barons and lords getting their money to try witches. Fair play. And in this example, they say like, apparently this sect had 700 members, and one of them said, you know, 1 more year and we would have been the lords and masters of this land. So what we can see here is, on the one hand, I mean, again, what people say while under torture, because witchcraft was seen as a crimen exceptum, which means like you can torture people essentially. Under torture, especially while being like tried by these inquisitors, shouldn't necessarily like take what they say as truth. But when there's things that kind of diverge from the classic, you know, the classic examples, this might be where there's grains of truth there. So what this points to is a group, some kind of society outside of the purview of the Catholic Church, who were gathering at night. And now, as Federici says, this could be like, you know, the peasant rebellions organising at night. But what we're going to look at after the Malleus Maleficarum is like, was there any magic going on? Why did the Valdensians become witches? Which is where it starts to get really interesting, and I'm excited for this section. But I must first deal with the classic text, the Malleus Maleficarum, because it was really instrumental in, well, as I said, these last examples are all men, in sedimenting the idea of the witch as a female. Fucking burn that motherfucker.